All right, the movement of matter. This should look familiar. All right, the nitrogen cycle. Actually, the nitrogen cycle's kind of complicated, um, but there are six key elements to the nitrogen cycle, and we call those macronutrients. Those are things that are needed by organisms in usually relatively large amounts in order to survive. Nitrogen is an element that most organisms need in pretty high amounts because it's used to form amino acids and amino. Hey, Lillian.
Let's dump him.
Lillian. Shh.
1, 2, 3. Oh!
Lillian. If you remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins and nucleic acids. Um, so, because so much nitrogen is required to build these things, we call nitrogen a limiting nutrient, which means it's required for everything to grow, but it's relatively has low relative availability. So, pretty much, a lack of nitrogen constrains organisms to grow and develop. So, adding other nutrients such as water, phosphorus, is not going to improve anything's ability to grow if the soil or the water or whatever the organism is growing in is nutrient poor. Nitrogen has a chemical transformation that when it moves through the atmosphere and into soils, it goes through several fixation patterns, including like the production of fertilizers. In soil, nitrogen can exist in several forms. And denitrifying bacteria release the nitrogen gas back into the atmosphere. Even though Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen by volume, the vast majority of nitrogen is in a gas form, and producers cannot use it. Lillian, can you possibly eat those chips any louder? Look, hey. Shh. Nitrogen fixation is a process that converts nitrogen gas that's in the atmosphere, N2. If you remember, have no fear of ice cold bears. It's the no. Into forms of nitrogen that producers, plants essentially can use. Another process or step in is nitrification. That's when the conversion of the ammonium ion, do you remember that polyatomic ion, is converted into nitrite and then into nitrate, NO3 minus. These conversions are conducted by specialized species of bacteria. They're just totally fascinating. And they move the nitrite that is not being used by most producers into nitrate, and it's relatively easy for them to do. And so nitrate, NO3 minus one charge, it's kind of what we're going for here. That's the usable form of nitrogen. Once producers take up nitrogen in the form of ammonia or the ammonium ion or nitrate or nitrite, I'm sorry, they incorporate the element into their tissues in a process that we call assimilation. So a consumer gets nitrogen when it feeds on a producer. Some of that producer's nitrogen that is assimilated inside of its tissues, the consumer will eat that and it'll move into their tissues. And then most of the other nitrogen is disposed of as waste. Eventually, everything dies and their tissues decompose. Um, in this process, it's called mineralization. Fungus and other bacteria decompose and break down the dead tissues into organic matter. Um, these fungus and bacteria essentially break down organic matter and turn it back into the inorganic compounds. In the nitrogen cycle, the process of mineralization is sometimes what we call ammonification because that inorganic compound is the ammonium ion. The ammonium produced by this process can either be taken up by producers in the ecosystem, or it's usually converted into nitrite and nitrate through the process of, if you remember, nitrification. See, this is slightly complicated. Denitrification is the final step in the nitrogen cycle, and that is the conversion of the nitrate ion, NO3, in a series of steps from gaseous nitrous oxide, which is N2O, and then eventually back into atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2 gas, the diatomic molecule. The denitrification process is also held by some specialized bacteria. They live in anaerobic conditions. Those are conditions without oxygen. A lot of times, like waterlogged soils or at the bottom of sediments, like the bottom of oceans, lakes, and you guessed it, swamps. And they have a very, very familiar smell to them. Kind of smells like rotten eggs. Nitrogen is a limiting nutrient in most terrestrial ecosystems, and so excess inputs of nitrogen can lead to, huge consequences. For example, nitrate is readily transported through the soil through water and what we call leaching, which is a process in which these dissolved molecules are transported through the soil via the groundwater system. In addition, adding nitrogen to soils by the use of fertilizers ultimately increases atmospheric concentration of nitrogen in regions where fertilizer is applied. So to sum up a visual here of what the nitrogen cycle looks like, atmospheric nitrogen is moved into what we call the ammonium ion, all right? Ammonia to ammonium ion. And then from there, we lose that hydrogen, turning it into nitrite and then nitrate. And nitrate is something that we like because that can go into the producers that are in water, and they can go through their nitrogen cycle. So there's a way I like to remember how this works, and it's called FIX, NAD, and PAN, which stands for nitrogen fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, denitrification, ammonium, nitrates, proteins, ammonium, and nitrogen. So I'm going to kind of show you a summary on how I would remember this. Okay, so to sum this up and help you remember it, FIX, NAD, and PAN. If you look in the top corner there, that's my mnemonic for summing up and memorizing the nitrogen cycle. And this is how I memorized this in college. All right, so with each part of the nitrogen cycle, there's a process and there's a product. All right. So FIX, NAD, nitrogen fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, denitrification. That's my FIX, NAD. Okay, so this is going to sound stupid, but all right. So my FIX, NAD produces my ANPAN. So the process of FIX, NAD produces ANPAN, which is ammonium, nitrates, protein, ammonium, and nitrogen. So when I'm looking at the diagram here, if I were to sum it all up, this process produces that process produces that, and so on. Alrighty, there we go. So I'm going to sum up the denitrification process through a diagram that I've created, so you won't find this anywhere. So this ion right here, NO3, that's nitrate. That's what everyone wants, right? Nitrate is used by plants and animals. And when we talk about plants, that process of nitrate to plants, going right here, this is the process of assimilation. I'm having a hard time writing this thing. All right, so plants and animals, they eventually die or pee. When that happens, they produce this NH4, the ammonium ion. If their death has occurred, we call that mineralization. I hope you all have the printed words of this. You're not relying on my handwriting. Mineralization. The ammonium ion transforms into nitrite, that guy, and through the process of what we call nitrification. All right, so NH4 to NO3, nitrification. Nitrite, which is what everyone wants, and actually someone else who wants it, is the atmosphere. So nitrate can turn into atmospheric, have no fear of ice cold bears, and two, that atmospheric nitrogen can also turn into the ammonium, NH4, through a process called nitrogen fixation. All right, so that's my summary diagram for the denitrification process.